Doug to speak with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn. Happy to be here tonight, but before I get started, I want to urge everybody to go out and buy a Mega Millions ticket. And if you win, you have to put it towards conservation. That'll be easy. Okay, I want to talk about my idea of nature's best hope. I'll give you a spoiler. You are nature's best hope. And we'll talk about why I think so. But before we move on with that, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. Of course, he was one of the best scientists of all times, not just our time, died the day after Christmas last year. It was a terrible loss to the world of conservation. But one of the things that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of biodiversity, his love of life on Earth. And he worked tirelessly to try to save it, not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survivorship. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he had one simple message. If we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we have to save nature. We have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature or functioning ecosystems on half of the planet. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a wonderful message. We'll just put half the Earth aside and everything will be great. Problem is, half of planet Earth is already in some form of agriculture, half of terrestrial Earth. The other half has got 8 billion people in it and all of our airports and roadways and houses and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So a lot of people are wondering how we could actually do this. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I do think we can realize EO's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation in order to do that. Before we talk about that, let's talk about what happened on the East Coast in 2019. We had a very large oak mast in the red oak group. Members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, and of course, its head through that hole, then of course, its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. And finally, it plopped down. A dangerous time for this insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. It takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa, and then surprisingly stays underground in that chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do. But that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in that hole. And that's how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the very next year the way most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave an acorn, it leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after the acorn weevil has left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody, time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn. It takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes into that acorn. And this is where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? Well, that's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that comprise the bulk of nature, mostly interactions between animals and plants. This is another one, the relationship between jays of all kinds, and oaks. They're the primary disperser of oak acorns. They will take an oak and they will fly up to a mile from the parent tree. Then they tap it below the soil surface. And the object is going to go back and have something to eat in the wintertime. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That is what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this beautiful moth, the beloved Emarginia, unless you have mistletoe, and you won't have mistletoe unless you have those oaks. That is the only plant that moth can develop on. There won't be 60 species of bees in California unless you have the pollen of perennial sunflowers. They specialize on the pollen of those plants. And it turns out the pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So nature is a series of specialized relationships. The problem today, though, of course, is that many of these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, stood on the edge, looked out over its wonderful scenery, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. But we didn't leave most of the country as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And those are mostly mountaintops. Now, that's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. Got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need them to sustain, because that is what keeps us alive on this planet. So you might wonder why we've done this. I wonder why we've done this, and I don't know, but I suspect we thought that the Earth, our nest, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. Of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty serious headlines these days. Like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one. You all know this one. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. It's a third of our North American bird population, already gone. And now the UN says, well, we're probably going to lose 1 million species to extinction. It's probably going to be in the next 20 years. And they said it 2 years ago, so I guess it's now the next 18 years. This makes a very nice headline, but it is not an option, folks. These are the species that keep us alive on the planet. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen. I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses, but that's not what this talk is about. This talk's about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if we lost insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappear, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, those food webs would collapse and those animals would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that functioning ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do that we depend on every day, like oxygen, pretty important. Clean water. Plants are cleaning our water, slowing its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their root system. That's the part that's underappreciated. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. And once it's in the soil, it's extremely stable. It can stay there for thousands of years. Plants are building topsoil, holding it in place. They're preventing floods. They're damping severe weather. They're converting sunlight to food. If we lost our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, and that'll be hard. What do animals do for plants? Lots of things, but here's some important ones. They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services, it's just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks, we do have preserves, they're doing the best they can, but we are in the 6th great extinction event the Earth has ever experienced, which means it's not good enough. They're not able to do everything we need them to do. So we now have to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like this. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he really believed that we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called a land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about that I know of was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. That means we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, back to private property. Most of the country is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. Actually, California has one of the lowest amount of private property, 52%, but it's still a big chunk. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not really using it correctly. We certainly do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left. Absolutely. That has been our conservation model for the last century, and we want to keep doing that. But we have to go beyond that now. We have to put nature back together again. In so many of the places we've dismantled it. That's called restoration biology, restoration ecology. And before you tell me that you're never going to put it back together again the way it was before we dismantled it, I know that. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions to create functioning ecosystems again, even if it's not exactly what was on that spot at some time in the past. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the ones that are providing the most services. And there's two groups that we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course, the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. These plants are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into food. And that is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So now we have plants that have created food, and they've stored that food in their parts, mostly their leaves. But if we don't get that food to animals, we don't have any animals. Well, most vertebrates, it turns out, don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate those plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects. And not just any insect. It turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee that's in southeast Pennsylvania where I live. There's several chickadees around the country, and they're all pretty much doing the same thing. Those are the birds at our feeders, some of the birds at our feeders eating seed all winter long, and we tend to think that's all chickadees need. Well, even in the wintertime, only 50% of their diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch entirely to invertebrates. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students did a few years ago, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers around the country, asking them to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest. Some of you may have participated in this study. It was very successful. Ashley got thousands of pictures. And the idea was she was going to identify the prey items in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as possible. And you're looking at a summary of her results for the 20 most common bird families. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen if we design landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars in them? Most of our birds would not be able to successfully reproduce. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars. One of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he is a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. A thin wrapper is its exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. The beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. A single medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, many of our smaller birds do chase aphids around. Let's see if they're chasing them. No, not chasing them there. But do you want to chase 200 aphids, or do you want to get one caterpillar? Caterpillars are nutritious. They're high in fat. They're high in protein. Low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And many beetles have really sharp edges too. And then finally, it turns out that birds are the best source of carotenoids. Caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids, not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants, and we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from during the breeding season? From what they're eating, of course. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey items. These first two bars are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars. Here are the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. Only the caterpillars are eating the green leaves. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting the caterpillars are not optional parts of most bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? One or two a day enough? That's a good question. So let's go back to chickadees. There's a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of Carolina chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days, but they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count them. So that really is tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you would, because in so many places, that's all we have, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard, because they're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. They're only foraging about 50 meters from the nest. And that is true for most breeding birds. They forage very close to the nest. And if we landscape in a way that does not produce all those insects, all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like that's one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups. the species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like doves and finches and crossbills, they can actually make a little milk out of seeds and feed that to their young. And look, they didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. But the birds that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, be pretty, and that's okay. We can keep doing that, but now they have to be pretty and ecologically functional, and that's not going to happen unless we add caterpillars to those landscapes. So how do you add caterpillars to landscapes? You do that by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. Seems pretty straightforward. But there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. We have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about which plants they can eat. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the hostas and the ginkgos and the eucalyptus and all the things that we typically landscape with from other continents on your property, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Well, remember, plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are they're restricted to the plant lineages for which they have specialized adaptations that allow them to get around, to circumvent those chemical defenses. They develop specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of evolutionary history for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch butterfly is not going to start to develop on your hostas. It's locked into milkweeds, and it has two choices in that case: fly away and find milkweeds someplace else if it can, or starve to death. It turns out this is actually pretty easy. There are three kinds of plants that are out there: plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and we even have plants that actively detract energy from local food webs. One of the best contributors, the best contributor across the country actually, is any one of our oaks. Oaks are contributing more energy to local food webs than any other type of plant. Ginkgo biloba from Asia is a great example of a non-contributor. Nothing eats a ginkgo, so it's not adding any energy to local food webs. And a detractor would be any one of our invasive plants that not only, this is salt cedar, not only does it not support local insects, but it moves into our natural areas and pushes out the native plants that do. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to rebuild the food webs that support our local ecosystems in this great restoration that I'm talking about, we've got to use the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants, starting with my house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. It's where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000. We moved into, there was a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots, very old farm. The east is very old. This was farmed for just about 300 years. Soil was exhausted. The last thing they did was to mow it for hay before they broke it up. And our job was to restore the ecosystem here, to put it back together again. And we took that job on before we knew how to do it, actually. But one thing I knew these ecosystems needed was caterpillars. So this was a species I tried to add early on, the Canadian owlet. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet before, but I thought it'd be interesting to see if we could get it to make a living at our house. That's what the caterpillar looks like. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. But you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have their host plant, unless you have meadow rue. And we didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure it was there hundreds of years ago, but with all the agriculture, it was long gone. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace and I planted them and they grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for about 2 months after I planted it. And then I was walking by for another reason, and I looked over, and it was covered with Canadian owlets. I'm still surprised about that. So now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's actually a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Bidens aristosa, ditch daisy. And we didn't have any Bidens aristosa either, but I did know of a power line cut about 14 miles away that did have some Bidens. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, this summer they took over my front yard. That's okay. Well, we had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Bidens. They finally did, and now we have a good population of both of those. So we've added 4 species to the property. I want to see if I get the hackberry emperor at our house. Not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be making a living on our property. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I got some hackberry trees, planted them. Had to wait 4 years for the butterfly to find my hackberry, but they did. And now we've got a population of them. So now we've added 6 species to the property. And that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own. And along with it came many of the specialists on goldenrod. Things like the beautiful brown hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct sparaginophis, the goldenrod gall moth. There are about 110 species of caterpillars on goldenrod, very powerful plant. I also planted Virginia creeper. I don't know what you folks think about Virginia creeper, but people in the East don't like it. And I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover. It makes nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. And by nutritious, I mean they are high in fat. And that is what migrating birds need. There's twice as much energy in fat as there is in sugar. And those berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers in the spring. You don't even know Virginia creeper is in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. It's a great pollinator plant. Remember, when you're planting a garden for pollinators, you're planting it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the evening primrose moth at our house, just because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, we didn't have any evening primrose, believe it or not, so I planted that. The moth came, spends a day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but it's always very cute. Now, this is a moth you can get if you have evening primrose, the Pacific green sphinx moth, a specialist on it. This is on my bucket list. I want to find that one day. And I planted lots of oaks. These are just examples of the plants that I put back at our house. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, and remember, that's our new goal in landscaping, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to call in the moths that made the caterpillars that run the food web at my house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks at our house, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and there's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to support the life around you. It'll happen the very first year. This is what our house looks like in the summer these days. That's where the Bidens colonized this year. But I just want to show you this to show you we put some plants back. I'm sure we don't have all the species we had before it was farmed hundreds of years ago, but we're getting there. And my research over the year has shown that the number of moth species in your local food web is a very good index for how productive and how stable that food web is. So 5 years ago, I took on the challenge of trying to take a picture of every species of moth that is now making a living at our house. And I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,199 species of moths that have come back to our house because we put the plants back. We have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So in 1/240,000th of the landmass, we've got 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we hear all the time. World Wildlife Fund said the Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I am sure we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn these headlines around. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres. A lot of people have less land than that. Will it work on smaller plots in suburbia? That's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development, so all their neighbors had the big lawns. When they moved in, their property was totally choked with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. It's another invasive species from China. So they got rid of that. They planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. Now, you Audubon folks know that is a good number. Just to compare that to our house, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, that's O'Hare Airport right over there. Pam has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural area at all, so she is a little island in the middle of Chicago. It's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper and she knows how to do it. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, a water feature, and then she sat back, she says, with a glass of wine, and started to count the birds using her yard. And she's up to 124 bird species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. If you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. There it is. All right, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And we need to succeed in a big way. And one of them has to be shrinking the area we have in lawn. Now, I know these days, California is not contributing to this problem in a big way, but boy, the rest of the country is. We've got about 44 million acres of lawn nationwide now. That's an area bigger than New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. And we do that because it's a status symbol and because we have to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? Now notice I'm not saying get rid of lawn. I'm saying cut the area in half. What if we take areas like this and turn them into this? Got this picture from Dan Getman in Missouri, I believe. I never met Dan, but he said, look, I'm doing it. I had this big lawn. I'm putting in the plants just like you say. Well, if we do it over 20 million acres, cut that area of lawn in half, we can create a new national park right where we live. And I'm calling that Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? We put some part of nature right where we live. We get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with Mother Nature. Either rekindle one we had as a child or develop it for the first time. We can do it at our own time, our own pace. All we have to do is go outside or maybe just look out the window. We can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park these days, last year, 375 million people be there with you. It may not be the experience you're looking for. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. And I think that alone is so important, not mediated by somebody else. And it's particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying, we get 30 kids, put them on a bus with a teacher. They drive for an hour. They go to a natural area and they walk around for an hour. And the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and get to know it, discover it, become friends with it, fall in love with it, alone, no parental supervision. Let them do this on their own. When we hover over our kids, we are sending the message that this is dangerous stuff. This is something you should fear. And that's a bad message to send, because these are the future stewards of our planet. If they're afraid of it, if they don't know how to steward it, if they don't love stewarding, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a tiny little piece of lawn with a hedge, but there are anoa lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put the lizard in an aquarium. You learn how to take care of the lizard. You fall in love with that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture not long ago, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I guarantee it's going to help her be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Sternisty's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to get kids to interact with the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, please do. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org. It is free. The object here is to register your property on the map and the amount of area on your property that you're going to be a good steward of. Even if you haven't done it yet, just a pledge. Maybe you really are going to cut your lawn in half or get rid of it altogether. Maybe you're going to plant a Gary oak. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot, California lilac. Anything you do, record that area, and your little piece of your county is going to light up, and you'll get to see everybody else in your county who's on Homegrown National Park. The object is to get the message that we all are a critical component of the future of conservation. We want to get that message to go viral. We are asking people to reduce the area that's in lawn. There's just not much good to say about it in terms of ecological contributions. And we're going to replace those areas with more natives. We're going to remove invasive plants that are already on our property. Most people do, in fact, have invasive species on their property. If we own any protected natural areas, we certainly want to keep protecting them. The ecological products of Homegrown National Park is a significant increase in biodiversity, and what's happened at my house proves that it's not that hard, and it does happen. A measurable reduction in invasive species. What I didn't tell you is that our 10 acres was thoroughly invaded with invasive species from Asia. So before we started our restoration, we had to get rid of them. There are now fewer. you put all those plants back, replace lawn, put those plants back, it's going to cause a significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. You're helping climate change by putting the plants that are going to sequester carbon back into our landscapes. And we're going to start to transform the areas outside of our parks into viable habitats. Right now, anything outside of our park is a no man's land. So if we make viable habitats in between parks, now we've got some connectivity, and it'll really help those creatures that are inside the park. We have a sociological product as well, national awareness, not just of what the problem is, but what the solutions are. We're trying to change the culture. Right now, we've got an adversarial relationship with nature. We want to change that to a collaborative one. We want people to recognize that nature is not optional. It's essential, and everybody owns responsibility to sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is great, but it's time for action, and there's a number of things individuals can do to really turn this around. And the map is going to merge national conservation efforts that already exist. Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, California Native Plant Society, Wild Ones. There's organizations all over the country. And since we don't charge, we're not drawing people away from these organizations. We're simply trying to record all of the good conservation that's happening on private properties right now that is not being recorded. We're doing better than people think. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to join Homegrown National Park. What plants should we put in the landscape when we replace that lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I call keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And when you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, when you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses. That's because they're making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that are holding up that house. You can't build an ecological house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. You're not through building your house once you've got your keystone plants, but it's a great first step. So the question is no longer simply, are native plants ecologically better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But there's a lot of native plants that aren't contributing all that much either. So the question really is, do we want to favor those big contributors, the native plants that are supporting the most pollinators and the most caterpillars, or not? What is supporting the most caterpillars? Well, it's oaks. All around the country, it's wherever oaks occur. They support over 950 species of caterpillars nationwide, 270 species of caterpillars in California. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. If you want to know the keystone plants where you live, you folks in California are lucky because you've got Cowscape. That is the best tool for figuring out what are the best plants for where you live, not just your county. You know, the counties in California are huge, and you've got such varied topography with all your different ecoregions that you need to know exactly what plants occur where you are. And if you go on Cowscape, you can see where every native plant is geo-referenced. And you can see the number of caterpillars that they support and pick the ones that are best for your area. Very powerful. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. A lot of experiments, a lot of research showing that light pollution is a major cause of insect declines. And these are all the ways that lights are killing our insects, particularly those moths that create those caterpillars. This is actually good news to me, folks. We've got to turn around insect declines, not just stop them. We've lost more than 45% of the insects on the planet so far. They are the little things that run the world. So we've got to increase those insect populations. And if we can do that by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There are a lot of switches to flick, but that's okay. It's still easy. But I know what you're going to say. Well, I can't turn the light out over my barn, or I can't turn it out over my garage or my front porch because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to realize, the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, something even easier, take out the white bulb and put in a yellow bulb, yellow incandescent or LED, because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects than our blue or white wavelengths. If we switch out our white bulbs for our white bulbs for yellow bulbs, overnight, we will save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, millions of dollars as well. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. This is something we're just starting to think about. So here's an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves of the tree, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches. Then it emerges as an adult. Then it does it all over again. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species finish growing as a caterpillar on the tree, and then they drop from the tree, and they wiggle their way beneath the soil under the tree and pupate, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree, and that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree, and we mow and compact our soil so they're rock hard, very difficult for those caterpillars to get underground, which means if we use those important plants to call in the moths to lay their eggs, we're creating an ecological trap. We're calling in caterpillar development that drop down and then die. And that's of course not the goal either. I am convinced that the typical way we landscape, because we don't tolerate beds under our trees, is another major cause of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. Is what most people do. They got a tree in a yard. I've got a new grad student this year who is just starting to measure how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a layered landscape. You've got a tree, then maybe an understory plant, azalea, ferns, ground cover. You're creating a soft landing here. The ground is not compacted. It's not going to be mowed. Nobody's going to walk on it and squish the caterpillars. They can easily get underground. Lots of leaf litter under there to spin their cocoon. Survivorship is going to be much higher. You can use bearberry, manzanita. There are a lot of ground covers that would be perfect for landscaping for those caterpillars under your tree. Yerba buena. Again, lots of opportunities. Another grad student, former grad student, Desiree Narango, has done some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results actually suggest there's room for compromise in our plant choice. And that's good news to me. She had one simple question, went into residential yards and said, how well do chickadee populations do in landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by typical non-native introduced ornamentals? And when they're dominated by introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you reduce the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So their nest box is up, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they produce 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. And if you put all that information into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. We looked at woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. This dotted line is replacement rate. That is the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. And if you reproduce at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. But if there are fewer babies than adults die, anything down here where you've got a lot of non-native plants, then you have an unsustainable shrinking population. Right here is where those lines, liberally speaking, intersect, which means you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web. This is the area of compromise. Now, we can't tolerate any invasive species because they're ecological tumors. They just escape and keep growing and growing and eventually castrate our local ecosystems. But there are a lot of ornamental plants that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? Did you notice this is a ginkgo? Why does Dan have a ginkgo in his native planting? He's got a ginkgo in his native planting because his wife likes ginkgo and asked him to put one in. So he did. Is that ginkgo destroying the functionality of this landscape? No. Is it going to escape and become an invasive species? No, it's just there. So I tend to think of plants that are just there as statues. So there's Dan's statue. If everything was pistachio, it wouldn't work, but Dan can get away with this. It's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of the powerful native plants, those big contributors. If we increase the percentage of these, we can tolerate many of these. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. You don't get more formal than that. Taken by a drone 400 feet up. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in Europe all the time in formal designs. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbors this is not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. It's not very big, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Well, the media is going to tell you we need them because they pollinate a third of our crops. I don't like that argument because people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. It's also not true. They pollinate about a 1/12 of our crops. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. You know, the earth is run, it's more than about us, folks. We need all of those plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. California lilac, wonderful pollinator plant, and it's beautiful too. That's great. Kathy Kramer's got some wonderful examples of great pollinator plants, our native asters. So you can do it in California as well as in the East. This is a Drew Latham design, much bigger than the other one. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. That's my point. We can do much better. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota's got a cost-sharing plan that encourages homeowners to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. Pennsylvania has a similar program at this point. There's an island off of Florida that's paying people to help burrowing owls, listed species, allow them to burrow in the front yard. I think this is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. Rather than fine people if they have an endangered species on their property, let's pay them to take care of it. Everybody would want an endangered species. How about a bounty on invasive plants? Calorie pear, one of the most invasive ornamentals we have in the entire country. St. Louis, Missouri put a bounty on it. Fayetteville, Arkansas. South Carolina's banned them altogether. North Carolina's got a bounty on them. You take a tree out and you get a free replacement. More and more public utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water efficient native species instead of the thirsty non-natives. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in California. This has gone up now. You get $3 per square foot for every square foot of lawn that you remove and replace with a xeric planting. I know you're getting rain now, but you still don't have any water that you can afford to waste on lawn. And if you want more information on all of these different programs, then memorize that. All right, I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like it. We like to visit it. We like to hike in it, like to take its picture, but it's not essential. And of course, if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, then nature takes a back seat. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife, so that future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for supporting the national park system. These are beautiful places. We want to save them so that future generations can enjoy them. And I get that because nature is enormously entertaining, but it is far more than that. We want to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about that. But if we restrict our conservation efforts just to areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because there's not enough of those areas. They're too small and they are too isolated. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We have to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to create viable habitats in all those places where we've destroyed them. This is starting to happen. It's really starting to happen. And when we get a little bit further along, it'll be the first time in modern history where humans actually have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few ecologists, a few conservation biologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. Mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We're good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. Right now, more and more people are recognizing that the Earth is in trouble, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can use keystone plants, one person can adjust their light system, one person can get rid of the invasive plants on their property. We didn't say much about that. One person can do all the things I just talked about and totally revitalize the little piece of the ecosystem where they live. And if they do that, it'll start to enhance their local ecosystem instead of detract from it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just think about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. As a volunteer, they will love you. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. So I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was amazing as always. I mean, I think you're preaching to the choir. They're just always nice to do. So I say personally that I dug up my lawn when I bought the house. When I moved to California, back to California, and I bought this house. The first thing I did was I sheet mulched the lawn, and on Friday, I am finally planting my native plant garden, and so I'm very excited that that's finally happening. Hopefully, with all this rain.
Yeah, good time to do it. Yeah.
All right, let's back up a little bit. There were some really amazing questions in here, and a lot of great commentary. People had a ton of resources, and I just wanted to share that we will download a copy of the chat. And we will extract all of the web links that are in it and post it with the recording. So you can come to Golden Gate Audubon's website, and we'll share that with all of our partners, and if they can post it on their websites too. So if you didn't catch all these amazing resources that have been shared, we will give you another opportunity to get them. A lot of them are repetitive, so Calscape is up there about a dozen times. I think I posted it at least 3 times myself. But I'm going back to find some of the good questions that were here. There was a really early on one that there was a question about when an acorn has a weevil, will it still grow into a tree?
It can. So acorns vary by size depending on the tree species. So some of the smaller oaks, the oaks that make smaller acorns, things like pin oak and water oak. Usually not. A single weevil will destroy that acorn. But the larger acorns, bur oak and red oak and some of the others, it can take one weevil, sometimes two weevils, and it'll still germinate. So it's not, it's lost some of its energy. It's not going to grow as quickly in the beginning as it would have, but it can still germinate. And it's funny, the jays actually, they know when it's going to germinate or not. They can weigh it. And if it doesn't feel quite up to snuff, they don't bother with it. They're only planting the ones that are probably really viable.
There's another really good question here. Sorry, how do you go through research? And I think maybe this was a question about how as a gardener, how do you find this? But I'm going to turn this into, as a scientist, how do you figure out what keystone species are?
Okay, we define keystone species. Knowledge builds upon itself, and one of the pieces of knowledge is that caterpillars are really important. So you want plants that make a lot of caterpillars. Well, for the last more than 100 years, people have recorded in the scientific literature what host plants are. So what we've done is comb the scientific literature, more than 4,000 references, and count up the number of caterpillars recorded on different plants. So we have a list of every caterpillar species recorded on every plant genus in the country. And we're actually making a similar list for the world. We're doing it everywhere in the world so that we can give this ranked list to any place. We can go to Germany and say, here are the plants you ought to be planting that are going to support the most caterpillars and help the food web the most. This is important these days because we've got the trillion tree initiative. Everybody's planting trees all over the place. But when you just plant eucalyptus or Australian pine or something, yes, you're sequestering carbon, but you are not helping the food web at all. And that's a big lost opportunity. So, but people don't know what are the best plants. That's why we're ranking them through the literature.
So the next question was actually, I think, answered well by many other participants, but I'm going to let you give us an answer to it too. What size yard is too small to make a difference?
No size yard is too small to make a difference. And one thing is we think we have just launched, yeah, we have on Homegrown National Park, our resources for container gardening. 82% of us live in cities with no property or just a balcony. Container gardening, picture an apartment building and everybody's got a small balcony. If there were containers with native plants on all those balconies, it would be a resource for a lot of bees, a lot of butterflies, that migrating monarch. I was in Asheville, Tennessee, I guess. And there was an apartment building just like that. All the balconies were loaded with plants, and I did not have my camera with me, but we really can turn what's just a pile of bricks into a resource, even though you don't own a lot of property, if we get those viable plants into our containers.
There's a lot of, is anyone doing work with municipalities to encourage pollinator gardens versus just drought tolerant?
Yes, they are. There are people all over the country that are interested in this. Remember, municipalities, a lot of these people are elected. They just want to be elected again. They'll do what their constituents want them to do. The mayor will do what we want them to do. We just tell them this is important to us. Most of the landscaping practices at the municipality level are based on past practices. We were just going to make spaces for humans that are pretty. Well, we're getting it that we need more than that now. So there's less pushback than there used to be. And it is starting to happen all over the place.
There's a question about your perspective on using native cultivars versus straight species. And I just read that section of your book. So
yeah, that's one of those common questions I get. And there's a surprisingly little amount of research on that. But this is what we know so far. We did one study looking at 6 different cultivar traits for woody plants. So we're not talking about flowers now. We're talking about if you take a tall plant, you make it short. If you take a green leaf and make it red or purple, or variegated leaves, if you enhance berry size, if you introduce disease resistance, these are all common cultivar traits in woody plants. And the only one that consistently reduced insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, because you're loading the leaf with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. Now, Amy White has looked at flowering plants at the University of Vermont. The news isn't quite as good there, because when you change flower shape and structure, and when you change the color, you're probably changing the UV spectrum too. And that's really what bees are looking at. We don't see that, and that is, it's very easy to mess up the relationship with the specialist bee species that are using that plant. Sometimes the generalists don't care. If we create a double flower, we've taken the reproductive parts of the flower and turned them into petals. So now there's no pollen and no nectar. But it's not a sure thing. There are cultivars that actually have more resources for pollinators. So it's a case-by-case basis, which makes it hard to predict. You can test it out yourself, buy a cultivar and see if anything uses it. But there's one thing that's consistent about most cultivars, and that is they are reproduced clonally, which means there's zero genetic variability. And in today's world of climate change, which is really increased climate variability, we need the most genetic variability we can get in our plant populations, so they have a hope of adapting to all these rapid changes. So that's a downside about cultivars that is pretty consistent. I would love to see nurseries just carry more straight species so that you have a choice. If you go to the nursery, you can say, I want a straight species, or I want this cultivar, but at least you have a choice. Right now, if you go there, most of the time it's just cultivars and you don't have a choice. So if you want that choice, ask for it. If they don't have it, don't buy something else until they get it. And then when they realize there's a market for it, they'll start to carry it.
There was a great question here from one of our more distant, maybe our most distant participant tonight. We have Catherine is tuning in from Hawaii, and she was wondering if there was a resource for Hawaiian native plants and homegrown national park in Hawaii, and I'm sure there is. I don't know if you know it off the top of your head, but.
Actually, don't be so sure there is. Hawaii's a tough place. We are working on it. I actually did some email exchanges today, but we're trying to do it by ecoregion now, and Hawaii, I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. I can't believe I got through the talk without doing that, but. Yeah. Hawaii's a mess because it's so vertical. You go up different ecoregions very, very quickly. So we haven't put that together again. We want to. It just doesn't exist yet. I'm sorry about that.
If you're in any of the regions where the dry forests grow in Hawaii, I do know that there are a number of really amazing groups that are trying to restore dry forests and are collecting seeds and making seed banks available of native dry forest species. So if that happens to be your part of Hawaii, Catherine, look for those resources. I'm sure there are other resources for native plants. I mean, I think any native plant that will grow. I mean, so little of the native flora of Hawaii is present in on most of the islands that probably any native plant would be good.
I want to give you my excuse. When people say we are working on this, it's really one person. It's my research associate, Kimberly Shrupshire, who is working like crazy to put all this stuff together, and she has been for years. We need more help with it. And Hawaii has always been off in the corner there because it's one of the harder places to deal with.
All right. Let's try to see. So we've got time for one more question. I think there are so many amazing comments. I will make sure that we download this chat because it's just filled with great information. we haven't mentioned, there's been a few mentions of bringing back the natives, which is the East Bay Native Plant Gardens Tour, which I hope to have my yard on someday soon. Going Native Garden Tour is on the peninsula. And we're working on San Francisco. So we've got a lot of the Yerba Buena CNPS folks are here tonight. I see your names popping up there. That's on our list for maybe next year. And there was a question about monarchs overwintering on eucalyptus trees, and which is obviously a non-native species and generally a species that we would consider an invasive species with very little wildlife value, but it does have it has not non-existent wildlife value. Any thoughts about species like that?
Yeah. My thoughts are that you want to look at the net benefit. So it could have, I mean, you hear this all the time. Well, this particular plant supports these pollinators and therefore it's good. Well, compare that to the negative aspects of that plant. If the positives outweigh the negatives, great. I don't know of any cases where that happens though. Even if, you know, the monarchs are hanging from the eucalyptus because it's there and they need a place to hang. There used to be Monterey pines and everything else where they hung just fine for thousands of years. They were very happy with that, but it doesn't mean you need to put in eucalyptus to save the monarch. You need to put in milkweeds to save the monarch because eucalyptus isn't making any monarchs. I know what you're saying, but it really is, it's the net benefit. You know, kudzu supports the silver-spotted skipper, but it also takes over millions of acres and wipes out, you know, tens of thousands of plants. So the obvious, the benefit does not outweigh the cost. You've got issues with eucalyptus too. So it depends. Look at that net benefit before you decide.
There's no service that eucalyptus provides that can't be provided by a native species. So
I would say so. The natives were doing pretty well a while ago.
Yeah. Yes. There's a comment which I think is a very important one about sort of acknowledging and seeking out the traditional ecological knowledge that is retained in the indigenous peoples, and in California especially there are you know, very active and well organized sources of traditional ecological knowledge that we definitely need to keep track of and to support the retention and expansion of that knowledge.
We need to tap into it, turn it over to them. They know what they're doing.
Yes, exactly. I've been managing landscapes. I mean, the indigenous people, the Ohlone people here in the Bay Area and the Bay Miwok, you know, manage these landscapes effectively for, you know, 10,000 years or somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years, and we've managed to mess them up in fewer than 200. So, yeah, we have a lot to learn.
You know, some of the more recent information is 24,000 years.
Oh my goodness.
Apparently they've been here a lot longer than we thought. So.
Oh, that's amazing. All right. Well, we are about to run out of time. And I would like to again thank all of my Audubon colleagues who are joined us tonight for helping us put this together. Of course, Doug and all of you. I mean, I cannot believe how much knowledge is in our chat right here. I promise you we're going to download it so we don't lose all of this. Thank you so much.
Glenn, can you send me a copy of that too?
Yes, I will.
See what everybody has to say.
Yeah. I will definitely do that. So thank you all again, and stay dry and safe.
Yeah.
And hopefully channel some of that water back into the ground where it belongs. And we look forward to seeing hopefully all of you next month for Scott Weidensaul's talk. And I hope that you are all going home and planting another native plant somewhere. So
good night, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you so much, Doug.
Very much.
I better save this again before I end it.